Rebecca Martinez felt an immediate chill when she first laid eyes on the photograph at the Riverside County estate sale. Unlike the other vintage images scattered throughout the collection, this portrait seemed to radiate an unsettling energy that made her hesitate before picking it up. The sepia-toned image showed a young woman in an elaborate Victorian dress, standing in what appeared to be a professional photographer's studio. Her dark hair was styled in the fashion of the early 1880s, but her eyes held a haunted quality that seemed to pierce through the decades. What dominated the composition was an enormous bouquet of wildflowers pressed tightly against her chest. Prairie, roses, Indian paintbrush, and desert marigolds arranged so densely they created an almost defensive barrier. But there was something deeply wrong with the scene. The woman's knuckles were white from gripping the flower stems, and her forced smile couldn't mask the terror in her eyes. The flowers themselves seemed wilted despite the photograph's clarity, as if they had been hastily gathered and arranged to conceal something urgent. Rebecca turned the photograph over and found an inscription that made her stomach drop. Eleanor. Hartwell, Wichita, Kansas, October 1882. Below that, in different handwriting with what looked like dried brown stains, someone had scrawled, "Justice for what he did to Mary." The photograph's technical quality was exceptional for a frontier studio, but more disturbing was the composition itself. The photographer had positioned Eleanor at an odd angle, as if trying to capture something specific about what she was holding. The lighting created dramatic shadows that seemed to emphasize the weight of whatever was hidden beneath those flowers. Rebecca paid for the photograph with trembling hands, unable to shake the feeling that she was looking at evidence of something terrible. The estate sale volunteer mentioned that the items had come from an old house in Pasadena that had been abandoned for decades, with no known relatives to claim the belongings. That evening, Rebecca couldn't stop staring at Eleanor Hartwell's haunted expression, wondering what tragedy had driven a woman to pose for such a disturbing photograph. In her home office, Rebecca positioned the photograph under her professional magnifying equipment, steeling herself for what she might discover. As she focused on Eleanor's hands, she noticed they were positioned unnaturally, not just gripping flower stems, but supporting something heavy and solid hidden within the bouquet. Using her highest power lens, Rebecca could make out the edge of a metallic object between the prairie roses. At first, she thought it might be a picture frame or jewelry box, but as she adjusted the lighting and angle, the horrible truth became clear. It was the barrel of a gun. Specifically, what appeared to be a Colt revolver, carefully positioned among the flowers with only a small portion visible to the camera. The weapon was stained with what looked like dark spots, and Rebecca's hands shook as she realized what those stains likely represented. Eleanor Hartwell wasn't just holding flowers in this photograph, she was displaying the murder weapon while posing as an innocent young woman. The image was a confession, a taunt, or perhaps evidence preserved for reasons Rebecca couldn't yet understand. She photographed the detail with her digital camera, enhancing the contrast on her computer screen. The gun was definitely there, deliberately positioned so that careful examination would reveal it, but casual observers would see only an elaborate floral arrangement. Rebecca immediately called Dr. Michael Torres at the Kansas State Historical Society, her voice barely steady as she explained her discovery. "Michael, I need you to look at something, but I have to warn you. This isn't just a historical photograph. I think I'm looking at evidence of a murder from 1882. Dr. Torres arrived the next morning, bringing equipment from the university's forensic laboratory. When he saw the enhanced images Rebecca had created, his face went pale. "My God, Rebecca, this woman is posing with what appears to be a murder weapon. We need to contact the authorities immediately." "But it's from 1882, Rebecca protested. "Surely any investigation would be closed by now." "Not necessarily," Dr. Torres replied grimly. "There's no statute of limitations on murder, even historical ones. And if this photograph is authentic, it could solve a cold case that's been open for over 140 years. Rebecca and Dr. Torres drove to Wichita to research the city's records from October 1882. What they discovered in the police archives sent chills down their spines. October 1882 had been marked by a series of brutal murders that had terrorized the growing frontier community. The first victim was Mary Garrett, a 19-year-old school teacher who had been found shot to death in her boarding house room on October 8, 1882. The second victim, discovered 3 days later, was Thomas Sullivan, a local merchant who had been killed in his store after hours. Both had been shot with the same weapon, a Colt revolver, but the gun had never been found. The police records, written in faded ink, described a community gripped by fear. "The killer strikes without warning and leaves no witnesses," wrote Police Chief William Murphy. "We believe the same individual is responsible for both murders, but we have no suspects and no motive. The weapon appears to be a standard Colt .45, but such guns are common on the frontier." Rebecca found the connection she was looking for in a witness statement dated October 12, 1882. A neighbor of Mary Garrett's had reported seeing a well-dressed woman leaving the boarding house around the time of the murder. The witness described her as young, with dark hair and an expensive dress, carrying a large bouquet of flowers. Dr. Torres discovered another crucial detail in the coroner's reports. Both victims had been shot at close range, suggesting they knew their killer and had allowed the person to approach them. This points to someone the victims trusted, the coroner had noted. Perhaps a woman, as they would be less likely to perceive her as a threat. The investigation had stalled after several weeks with no arrests made. The final police report, dated November 15, 1882, stated, "Case remains open pending new evidence. The killer has seemingly vanished, leaving only death and fear in their wake." Rebecca realized that Eleanor Hartwell's photograph might be that new evidence, 140 years too late to bring her to justice, but perhaps finally able to solve the mystery of who had murdered Mary Garrett and Thomas Sullivan in the autumn of 1882. The inscription on the photograph now made horrifying sense. Justice for what he did to Mary. Eleanor hadn't been the random killer the police had assumed. She had been seeking revenge for something that had happened to Mary Garrett. Rebecca and Dr. Torres located the site of Mary Garrett's former boarding house, now occupied by a modern office building. However, the Wichita Historical Museum had preserved extensive records about the building and its residents from the 1880s. The museum's archivist, Patricia Coleman, showed them the boarding house register from 1882. Mary Garrett lived here for 8 months before her death, Patricia explained. She was well liked by the other residents and had no known enemies. Her murder shocked everyone who knew her. But as they examined the register more closely, Rebecca found a disturbing entry. Eleanor Hartwell had also lived in the same boarding house, occupying a room just down the hall from Mary Garrett. According to the records, Eleanor had moved out abruptly on October 10, 1882, just 2 days after Mary's murder. Patricia pulled out a collection of letters that had been donated by former boarding house residents. Among them was a letter from another resident, dated October 5, 1882, just 3 days before Mary's death. "My dear sister, I must tell you about the strange situation developing here at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Our newest resident, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, has become quite agitated about something involving poor Mary Garrett. Eleanor claims that Mary has been interfering with her beau, though Mary insists she has done nothing wrong. The tension between them is becoming quite uncomfortable for all of us." Another letter, dated October 7th, provided more disturbing details. "Eleanor's behavior has become frightening. She accused Mary of trying to steal her intended husband, though none of us have ever seen this mysterious suitor. Eleanor has been making veiled threats, saying that Mary will pay for her betrayal. Mrs. Henderson is considering asking Eleanor to leave, but we all fear what she might do if confronted." Rebecca felt sick as she read these accounts. Eleanor Hartwell hadn't been seeking justice for Mary Garrett. She had been the one who murdered her, driven by jealousy and delusion over an imaginary romantic rival. The photograph now took on an even more sinister meaning. Eleanor had posed with the murder weapon not as evidence for justice, but as a trophy, a chilling memento of her crime, hidden beneath innocent flowers while she maintained the facade of a respectable young woman. Dr. Torres discovered the connection between Eleanor Hartwell and the second victim, Thomas Sullivan, in the merchant's personal papers preserved at the Kansas State Archives. Sullivan had kept detailed records of his business dealings, including a disturbing series of interactions with Eleanor in the weeks before his death. Sullivan's diary entries from September 1882 revealed growing concern about a customer who had become obsessed with him. "The young woman who calls herself Miss Hartwell continues to visit my store daily, purchasing unnecessary items and lingering for hours," he wrote on September 25th. "She speaks of marriage as if we have an understanding, though I have never encouraged such notions. Her attention has become quite unsettling." By early October, Sullivan's entries showed real fear. "Miss Hartwell's behavior has become frightening. She insists that we are engaged, despite my repeated explanations that I am already promised to Miss Catherine Wells of Lawrence. When I mentioned Catherine today, Miss Hartwell flew into a rage, declaring that any woman who interfered with her happiness would meet the same fate as that schoolteacher." Rebecca's blood ran cold as she read Sullivan's final diary entry, dated October 10th, the day before his murder. "I have learned that Miss Hartwell was acquainted with the murdered schoolteacher Mary Garrett. She has been making increasingly violent threats against anyone who betrays her. I fear she may be responsible for Miss Garrett's death, and I worry that I may be her next target. I have written to the police expressing my concerns, but they seem to believe that a well-dressed young woman could not be capable of such violence." The police had apparently dismissed Sullivan's concerns, a tragic example of the era's assumptions about women and violence. Sullivan's letter to the police, found in the investigation files, had been marked unfounded concerns and filed away without action. Dr. Torres found evidence that Eleanor had indeed visited Sullivan's store on the evening of October 11th. A witness statement from a neighboring shopkeeper described seeing a young woman with dark hair carrying flowers entering Sullivan's store just before closing time. The witness had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming she was a late customer. Eleanor's pattern was becoming clear. She used flowers as both a disguise and a weapon concealment method, approaching her victims under the pretense of innocent social calls while carrying the murder weapon hidden beneath elaborate bouquets. Rebecca tracked down the location of the photography studio where Eleanor's portrait had been taken, using address directories from 1882 Wichita. The studio had belonged to a photographer named Marcus Webb, whose business records had been preserved by his descendants. Webb's appointment book from October 1882 contained a chilling entry. October 15th, Miss E. Hartwell portrait session. Client insisted on specific positioning and lighting. Unusual request to photograph flowers. Paid in advance, cash only. Webb's personal notes written in the margins provided more disturbing details. Client seemed nervous and agitated. Insisted on holding flowers throughout session. When I suggested removing them for a clearer portrait, she became quite upset, saying the flowers were essential to the meaning of the photograph. She specified that the image must show everything she was carrying, though I'm not sure what she meant. Rebecca found Webb's business correspondence, including a letter to his brother dated October 20th, 1882. "I had the strangest client last week, a young woman who wanted her portrait taken, while holding an enormous bouquet of flowers. She was very specific about the arrangement and positioning, almost as if she wanted to hide something within the bouquet while still having it visible to the camera. The whole session felt wrong somehow, but she paid well and in advance." Most disturbing was Webb's final note about Eleanor. "After completing her portrait, Miss Hartwell asked me to make multiple copies and to preserve the glass plate negative indefinitely. She said the photographs might be important evidence someday, and that I should give copies to the proper authorities if anything happened to her. I didn't understand what she meant at the time, but given the recent murders in town, I'm beginning to wonder if this young woman knows more about them than she's saying." Rebecca realized that Eleanor had deliberately created evidence of her crimes, possibly as insurance against accomplices or as a way to maintain control even after her potential capture. The photograph wasn't just a trophy, it was Eleanor's attempt to document her crimes while maintaining plausible deniability. Webb's records showed that he had indeed made multiple copies of Eleanor's portrait, but most had disappeared over the decades. The copy Rebecca had found was likely one of the few remaining pieces of evidence from a calculated killer's confession. Rebecca's research into Eleanor Hartwell's disappearance after the murders revealed a chilling pattern of calculated planning. City records showed that Eleanor had sold all her possessions and closed her bank account on October 16, 1882, just one day after posing for her disturbing portrait. The Wichita police files contained witness statements describing Eleanor's final days in the city. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, reported that Eleanor had packed hastily and left without giving notice or forwarding address. She seemed excited rather than frightened, Mrs. Henderson told police. She kept talking about starting a new life somewhere far away. A bank clerk remembered Eleanor's final transaction. She withdrew her entire account balance and purchased a bank draft made out to E. Harrison, a different name entirely. When I questioned the discrepancy, she claimed it was her real name and that Eleanor Hartwell had been a stage name. She seemed pleased about shedding that identity. Dr. Torres discovered that Eleanor had purchased a train ticket to Denver under the name Elizabeth Harrison on October 17, 1882. Railroad records showed the ticket had been used, but there was no trace of Elizabeth Harrison or Eleanor Hartwell in Denver city directories from that period. However, Rebecca found a disturbing pattern in newspaper archives from cities along the Western Railroad routes. Between November 1882 and March 1883, several communities reported mysterious deaths of young men and women, all shot with similar weapons, all victims found after encounters with well-dressed women carrying flowers. In Denver, a shopkeeper named David Chen had been found dead in his store on November 8, 1882. Witnesses reported seeing a woman with dark hair and an elaborate floral arrangement leaving the area around the time of the shooting. In Colorado Springs, a schoolteacher named Margaret Ross had been killed on December 15th after several residents noticed her arguing with a refined woman who always carried bouquets. The pattern continued westward: Pueblo, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Flagstaff. In each city, the killer stayed only long enough to commit murder before moving on, always targeting individuals who fit a specific profile: young, successful people who might remind Eleanor of her original victims or represent the life she felt she deserved. Rebecca realized they weren't just looking at two murders in Wichita. They were tracking a serial killer who had used the railroad system to spread violence across the American West, leaving a trail of bodies from Kansas to California. Rebecca's research led her to Los Angeles newspaper archives from early 1883, where she found the final chapter of Eleanor's killing spree. The Los Angeles Times from March 12, 1883, carried a front-page story that made her blood run cold: mysterious woman arrested in multiple murders. The article described the capture of a woman calling herself Ellen Hayes after she had killed 3 people in the Los Angeles area over a period of 6 weeks. The description matched Eleanor Hartwell perfectly. Dark-haired woman of refined appearance, approximately 25 years of age, known to carry elaborate floral arrangements. The arrest report, preserved in Los Angeles Police Department archives, provided disturbing details about Eleanor's final crimes. She had murdered a young married couple, Robert and Sarah Mitchell, in their home on February 28, 1883. Neighbors reported seeing a well-dressed woman carrying flowers approach their door earlier that evening. Detective Samuel Rodriguez, who had investigated the Mitchell murders, wrote, "The killer gained entry by presenting herself as a friend bringing flowers to congratulate the couple on their recent marriage. Once inside, she shot both victims at close range with a Colt revolver. The weapon was found at the scene, along with the flowers, which appeared to have been arranged to conceal the gun during transport." What made Eleanor's capture possible was a witness who had seen her discarding blood-stained clothing behind a hotel. When police searched her room, they found multiple identities worth of documents, including papers belonging to Eleanor Hartwell of Wichita. The most chilling discovery was Eleanor's personal journal, which detailed her crimes with cold calculation. Excerpts from the journal, included in the police report, revealed her twisted psychology. Mary Garrett thought she could steal Thomas from me, but she learned the price of betrayal. Thomas himself proved unworthy of my devotion, so he joined her. Each city brings new opportunities to correct the wrongs done to me. The flowers make it so easy. People see beauty and never suspect death walks among the petals. Eleanor's journal contained detailed descriptions of at least 12 murders across 5 states, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in American frontier history. The trial of Eleanor Hartwell, using her real name, became a sensation in 1883 Los Angeles. Newspaper coverage from the period showed a city fascinated and horrified by the well-dressed woman who had used flowers to conceal her deadly intentions. The Los Angeles Herald's coverage of the trial provided disturbing insights into Eleanor's mindset. When asked about her motives, she had told the court, "I gave love and loyalty to those who proved unworthy. When they betrayed me with others, justice demanded payment. The flowers were fitting, beauty hiding the thorns that punish unfaithfulness." Dr. Theodore Whitman, an early psychiatrist who examined Eleanor before trial, wrote in his report, "The defendant shows no remorse for her actions and appears to believe her victims deserve their fate. She speaks of her crimes as acts of romantic justice, correcting wrongs done to her by unfaithful lovers and rival women. Her delusions are complete and dangerous." Eleanor's trial lasted 3 weeks, with evidence presented from multiple states. The prosecution built their case around her journal, the murder weapon, and witness testimony from survivors who had seen her in various cities. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but Eleanor's detailed planning and ability to assume false identities demonstrated clear premeditation. On June 15, 1883, Eleanor Hartwell was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. The judge's statement captured the horror of her crimes. "You have used the symbols of love and beauty, flowers that represent life and joy, as instruments of death and deception. Your crimes represent a perversion of everything society holds sacred about femininity and romance." Eleanor was executed by hanging on September 8, 1883 at the Los Angeles County Jail. Newspaper accounts described her as calm and unrepentant to the end. Her final words, according to the Los Angeles Times, were, "The flowers remember everything. They know who truly loved and who betrayed that love." After her execution, authorities from multiple states confirmed that the mysterious murders along the Western Railroad routes had stopped, conclusively linking Eleanor to at least 15 confirmed deaths. Rebecca's investigation had uncovered one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, a serial killer who had used society's assumptions about feminine innocence to commit murder across half the continent. Eleanor's photograph, with the gun hidden beneath flowers, was more than evidence. It was a chilling symbol of how appearances could deceive. The photograph now resided in the Los Angeles Police Museum, displayed alongside Eleanor's journal and the murder weapon as part of an exhibition on early American serial killers. Dr. Torres had helped authenticate the image, confirming that it was indeed taken by Marcus Webb in Wichita just days after Eleanor's first murders. The museum's curator, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, explained the photograph's significance to visitors. This image represents one of the earliest known instances of a killer deliberately documenting their crimes. Eleanor Hartwell understood that the photograph would outlast her, creating a permanent record of both her guilt and her twisted pride in what she had done. Rebecca's research had also led to the posthumous identification of several additional victims whose deaths had been attributed to random violence or remained unsolved. Families who had wondered for generations about their ancestors' mysterious deaths finally had answers, though the truth brought pain as well as closure. The Eleanor Hartwell case became a subject of academic study, with criminologists examining how her crimes had been enabled by 19th century assumptions about women and violence. Her ability to travel freely between states while committing murders highlighted the lack of communication between frontier law enforcement agencies. Most disturbing was the realization that Eleanor's photograph had been hiding in plain sight for over 140 years, passed down through families and estate sales, while the weapon that killed at least 15 people remained visible to anyone who looked closely enough. Rebecca established a fund to help law enforcement agencies digitize and cross-reference historical crime records, hoping to prevent other cases from remaining hidden for decades. She also worked with museums to create educational displays about the dangers of assuming that evil always looks monstrous. Standing in the police museum, looking at Eleanor's serene portrait with its hidden horror, Rebecca reflected on the photograph's dark lesson. The young woman who had arranged wildflowers to conceal a murder weapon had created an enduring reminder that the most dangerous predators often hide behind society's most trusted symbols. Eleanor Hartwell's flowers had indeed remembered everything. They had preserved the evidence of her crimes for nearly 150 years, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see the gun she had hidden among the prairie roses, and finally give voice to the victims whose deaths she had celebrated in that chilling portrait of beauty concealing brutality.